First one we have is the MGM Hack. So I'll give a brief synopsis or what happened here. So on September 11th, MGM reported they were dealing with a cybersecurity issue. If you went to social media, you found that hotel room keys weren't working, slot machines, their main website, and then other hotel electronics. September 20th, it came out that everything was back to normal-ish. And then on October 5th, MGM announced that attackers had accessed the personal information for guests and hotel residents, names, contact information, gender, date of birth, driver's license, passport, social security numbers, dating back to March 2019. A group called Scattered Spider, which uses social engineering techniques, claimed responsibility for the hack and got in, pretending to be an employee that they had found on LinkedIn and then calling the IT help desk. Ransomware was, of course, deployed, which is why kind of we're all here at this point, and why we're still employed. But I don't know who wants to go first, but thoughts on just the MGM hack in general at this point.
Stephen, take it away. Give your thoughts jumping in, because everyone calls it a hack, and it is. But where did it begin, right? And most people think of a bunch of people in hoodies breaking into computers, but this started really with social engineering. And I think that's what makes this one really interesting, of how they were able to gain access, and that then from there, the foothold in terms of the forensics and everything they did to discover how far and wide they got. But that initial point breach happened through social engineering. So, Stephen, love to hear your take on, because I think it expounds on when people start to talk about AI and how that could be used. Could AI be a better salesperson than you joining a call 2 years from now, selling somebody's product or having a discussion to get somebody to give them information?
It certainly could be, and is being used by the threat actor groups that are doing a lot of business email compromise and other forms of social engineering. But that is, Brian, to your point, I think what's most interesting about this, because it really, apart from all the common conversations about controls, frameworks, and really everything that becomes relevant from a cybersecurity underwriting and claims perspective, but that social element really was the gap in the armor that allowed this all to play out. And given it was an internal staff member with access to a lot of those systems that they targeted, there's not really a better use case for the need for a organizationally and risk aligned security awareness program to address this kind of proactively moving forward, especially for folks with that heightened level of access and the ability to be targeted in the same way. I think as a narrative or an overall arc that you could see play out in other environments in the future, this is really just one of many of these types of examples that we've seen in recent times, and represents, to your point, Brian, with the advent of generative AI, some real concerns about how this could be weaponized and taken to scale further than just a handful of affiliates with specific ransomware gangs.
And to follow along with that, because there's another element of this, which is around business mission and the dissonance sometimes between security posture and implementation and business mission, because it's important to remember that internal IT support is still considered customer support, but it's just internal customers. And that those organizations, those people within that organization, their performance reviews are actually based on time to resolution of an internal call. And so they're trying to be helpful without realizing that they're being compromised. And so how do we get that alignment between business mission and the importance of being secure, when my job in this instance, if I'm that person, is to get resolution quickly and to help that person get back up and running? And so certainly security awareness training is a key component of this, but oftentimes when we're looking at those security implementations, the question isn't asked, well, how are you being measured, person who needs to be secure and ask the right questions, but not create friction in the business environment? And I think that's a really interesting question that is brought to fore with this use case that really doesn't get discussed very frequently.
Couldn't agree more. I think that's the big reason that, and I talk about this all the time with folks that are discussing programs like this and training and what proactive measures you can do to prepare your people for situations like this. Security awareness training is not a throwaway or something that can just be canned anymore. It really needs to, Kirsten, to your point, be aligned with the role of the individual, the access that they have, the business mission, and what they're measured on. All of those things are critical and important for sure.
Yeah, Matt, I don't know if you want to jump in there, but I was also going to compliment on top of that and say the awareness training or the check the box training that some companies are doing. And I'm not slapping anyone for saying that they're doing a check the box, but when you look at business critical, right? A lot of companies now are meeting with their finance team and their HR team to go around scenarios when you were talking about, business email compromise and fraud, right? The entire company needs to understand the risk of clicking on, a phishing email, et cetera. But the finance team is going through additional training and countermeasures that when this comes through, what do we do first, right? Somebody asked to change the routing instructions for this. It's someone that I communicate with on a regular basis. I don't see any reason why this is wrong. How do we go about and check that? So they're putting additional checks and controls in place. But what does that do? That also slows down business and how business is done, right? Because there's additional checks being put in place. So regardless if it's product or training, there's things that get put in place in process that are going to add more friction. But that friction's put in place to protect the company. And that's something that comes from the top down, right? That when bought in and understood of what the risk is, it's cyber risk, but when these type of things come in, it's also process risk. Like what things have we put in place friction wise to make sure we prevent this happening? And then to this point on the NGM side, right? Like what are we doing to ensure that the people, even at the help desk side, then they're not in the finance or the HR side dealing with invoice fraud, right? But dealing with the day-to-day problems that arise. And I'll be the first to say before I ever joined cybersecurity and I was on the business side traveling the world, if something happened to my computer and I was told call the help desk, I mean, I was calling and saying, I need this fixed now. I'm out here, I'm over in this country. This has to be done immediately. And they're like, trying to get it done, right? There's a reason why some of that friction gets put in place. And if that Brian from back then doesn't understand that why, then I'm not going to understand the need for it. So I'm going to continuously push. And that's where that not just awareness training, but that understanding of how it aligns to the business.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and I think when you start to think about that from a security or risk discipline perspective, one of the ways that frequently shows up or should show up in conversations at the executive team level is anytime you're talking about what our key risks are, what are the threats and risks that are going to or are likely to lead to those outcomes, and how do we, what meaningful measures do we put, Brian, to your point, to make sure that behavior or the behaviors, and whether that's a specific ticket type or request type or specific types of access or requests for access, times of day, there's a lot of data to be looked at and monitored inside of all of those things. But that's where you start to get, I think, a really meaningful discussion between risk leaders and operational and other executive members of executive teams and boards, and start to help them paint the picture of, okay, these are the departments the business has, these are the dependencies and technical needs each of those departments have. What are the operational risks involved there? Where are the opportunities for us to get hurt, and build backwards from there, and make sure those conversations are also integrated with things like your incident response plan, the escalation process for getting in touch with legal resources, and just really having that not be each one of those things be an island, but make it a part of the headspace of the entire executive team and all those underlying operations leaders that are far removed from risk and security conversations under normal circumstances.
Yeah, and I just interject too. I think to echo kind of Brian's point, when he mentioned kind of like his past life. I mean, I think that's, really important to look at as we move from, like what I might think of as like kind of traditional person to person business, right? As you add e-signature and remote staff and, any of these new elements that make things more streamlined and more efficient. I think just taking a really deep dive and a look into, by not having that, in-person interaction, like how many more opportunities of, risk, and exposure have you created? And I think that's kind of the underlying issue with all of this. And particular to this with MGM, I think you have just a situation where obviously the staff itself, to your point, Stephen, a security awareness training, I think everybody, within the staff needs to understand like a case study like this and how severe that can possibly be. And then they might take it a little bit more serious going forward. I think it's just, everyone's so excited to see things more streamlined and moving so quickly that, they quickly forget, you know, what happens if you're not in an in-person meeting, right? Like there's drastic changes, and certainly with all the advances in AI, that's only going to get more and more in depth. I mean, and probably incredible over the next few years.
I would like to ask Stephen, though, about the question of network segmentation, because it doesn't really seem like, from at least the perspective of where we sit, I mean, we look at the social engineering element of it, but good heavens, they were able to move quickly across the environment. And certainly in our many discussions around defense in depth, I think also this highlights very closely that things like network segmentation really need to be reviewed.
Well, network segmentation and really network segmentation as a part of a greater zero trust strategy from an architecture and security perspective. You have to assume individual controls will fail. And Brian, I know you have this conversation all the time with folks that you advise on these fronts, but if you're banking on even a small subset of products that aren't necessarily zippered up in a way that they complement one another or create noise when when threat actors come up against the edges or uncovered extremities of those tools, that's when strategies like zero trust and network segmentation adopted across the board really reduced the blast radius of what is possible to happen under those kind of heightened circumstances. Because if they had some secondary controls like that in place on the MGM side, it may have been a very different outcome. We might not have even heard anything in the news about it. So, looking at that from a data-based and research-based perspective, that's something that we see a lot play out, and that's why those types of technologies are a critical part, in our opinion, of any responder's toolkit that's helping out with those types of issues.
So one thing,
Totally echo that sentiment. Sorry, on the micro segmentation, I could go down several rabbit holes, even bringing in automotive analogies in terms of one piece flow, but why certain parts that have real critical tolerances on them, right, are removed and segmented from the final assembly line and go through a DFEMA and PFEMA process for process failure mode analysis. Why not apply the same logic then into the processes that are used in business, right? What are the real critical keys to the kingdom, and what are the processes for people to get to those, right? And then you put in risk controls around that, the same reason you do in production, because at the end of the day, your business is creating this finished good part. At the end of the day, your business over here was making sure you have X number of consumers coming in and out of your locations, keeping everyone happy. But how do we control that? So anyhow, before I go too automotive into everyone.
I think network segmentation is definitely a good one. One thing I'll call out is that part of the MGM breach was the fact that IT just started shutting down systems as part of their incident response plan. So it wasn't that the attackers got to like all the hotel room keys, or I think MGM even came out and said they didn't even get to the slots. That was more like IT shutting down everything. Which is, I don't know if that's like a great incident response plan, but especially if ransomware is starting to get deployed, that is kind of one of our first steps is contain everything, right? Just to identify where they're actually at. But so I don't know if they got as far as they did. Some of that was IT shutting it down. But one of the things I do want to kind of get back to, and this is a key onto our next topic with